Alrighty, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in because I've been struggling to get this podcast recorded for multiple days now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Entrenched Podcast. Today we're going to be doing a book review. Just to fill you in with a little bit of detail for those who are listening, this will actually be the first podcast I've ever recorded in 2023. And it'll be the first podcast where the entire podcast is available on video, streaming on YouTube. Very excited to be kicking that off and finally getting that off the ground. I had to invest in a new computer to make it happen, had to get a new camera. I've been teasing it for the last couple of podcasts, but all of the pieces of the puzzle didn't come together until now. So now, finally, we have video recording for the entirety of the podcast on YouTube. So, the links, etc., will all be attached, and I might even add a little bite insert in the middle of this to tell you what the YouTube link is, because I'm not 100% sure what channel I'm going to drop it on, but it should be on the Entrenched channel. So let's dive in to the book review. Now, if you've ever listened to a podcast that had a book review before and you hated it, please don't tune out quite yet. And I'll give you two reasons. One, I'm Sam, and I have very unique takes on things, so I promise you this won't be a traditional book review. Two, I've never listened to a book review or podcast before. I don't even know if they exist, although I assume they do. So this is going to be unlike any book review you've ever seen before, because I have nothing to really reference it off of. We're just flying by the seat of our pants here. The book we're going to be reviewing is called The Culture Code: The Secrets to Successful Groups. Let me check out how to pronounce this guy's name really quick. Coyle. So the author is Daniel Coyle. Sorry, I was Googling how to pronounce his name because I wanted to make sure I got it right. And he writes this really interesting book called The Culture Code. And essentially, the premise of the book is how do groups, highly productive groups, create good cultures. And what he did is he went and studied highly successful groups that created great cultures, and like the Pixar, Tylenol, that was one of my favorite ones. It was one of the last stories. This place called the Greenhouse, of course, the Navy SEALs, all these different organizations, businesses, and places where great culture is constructed, or places where bad culture existed. And he studied, why was it successful? Why was it not? And not to spoil everything right up front, but he arrived at three key features for the book. So kind of a list of skills to create good culture that you need is you need to be able to build safety, you need to be able to share in vulnerability, and you need to be able to establish trust. Build safety, share in vulnerability, and establish trust. These three things are foundational for creating great culture in business, in your church, in your groups, or even in your friend groups. And that's why this book is very powerful and important for anyone. A lot of people might look at this book and see, the culture code, the secrets of highly successful groups, and leaders tend to gravitate towards books like these. And that's good, and as they should. But in order for great culture to take place, there's actually more weight on the individual taking responsibility for creating great culture. So in order to build safety, the individuals have to make each other feel safe. In order to share in vulnerability, everyone must share in vulnerability. And in order to establish purpose, the entirety of the group must pursue a goal, and they must unify around it and be excited about it. And that's why I think the kind of my takeaway from this book is, dang, I wish everyone who I knew had read this book, The Culture Code, and the groups that I'm a part of, so that I could intelligently and strategically talk about the good, the bad, and the uglies of how good culture works, and then how we as a group could move forward and have better culture. So please pick this book up. whether you're a leader, whether you're a church leader, business leader, or even whether you're just someone who's just part of a culture. And it'll also give you a great reference point. So one of the problems with, or one of my recommendations for anyone reading this book is really built around this premise. How do you know if you're part of good culture if you don't even really technically know what technically good culture is? Sure, you can feel it, but maybe you feel like your culture is pretty good and you're unaware of some pretty toxic things that are hiding in the shadows. Or maybe you think your culture is good and it's actually complete trash. And then this book will illuminate what really good culture looks like. Or maybe you're a part of a great culture and you've never really thought through it that deeply before, and this book will illuminate how good the culture is in the groups that you're a part of. And that'll only inspire you and encourage you to keep going forward. This only gives you extra tools in your tool belt in order to build better culture in the groups that you're a part of, whether you're a leader, a team member, a nobody, or whether you're someone who's in charge of everything. This book will give you tools and resources to better the cultures you're a part of, and that's why I recommend it for everyone. So the three key premises of the book. To cultivate trust and safety, you should strive for the following. Hey, this is really comfortable and engaging, and I'm curious about what everybody else has to say. In order to cultivate trust and safety, you should strive for the following attitude. Hey, this is really comfortable and engaging, and I'm curious about what everybody else has to say. And this is really foundational, and it's talked about in chapter 1. So how I'm going to do this book review is I'm going to kind of briefly graze over almost every chapter in the book, but we're just going to spend a few moments on each chapter. We'll just spend a few moments on each chapter, and I'm going to highlight the stories that they talk about in each chapter, the things that I think are interesting, and kind of the key takeaways. So first, chapter 1, the book is broken up into 3 sections, so you can see right here visually, build safety. And then the second section is, of course, share and vulnerability. Let's see if I can find it right here. Share and vulnerability. For those who are just listening, sorry, I'm showing my visual audience kind of the actual chapters of the actual sections of the group. And then the third, of course, is establish purpose. So these are the three key components of the book, and then each component has its own chapter group dedicated to it. So the first chapter is called The Good Apples, and it really dives into this fascinating story about this college university, I believe it was, and they did this study where they put a bunch of strangers in a room together, all pursuing a common purpose. And they strategically inserted a quote-unquote bad apple into the group who would kind of share negativity about the project. And they found that continually the group submitted to the negative vibes and intentions of that bad apple. Now, there was one group, however, where there was a good apple, and they didn't plant this person, who started to challenge the actions of the bad apple. And one of the things that they said was, and one of the things this guy was really, really good at is he would listen to the bad apple, give a rebuttal, and then he would, through his body language and through his vocal tone, he would give off this phrase that I quoted earlier. Hey, this is a really comfortable and engaging, and I'm curious about what everybody else thinks. So if you're wanting how to build safety, share vulnerability, and establish purpose, the first thing you need to do is build safety. Well, how do you do that? We dive right into it in chapter 1, and he talks about how creating a calm and inviting place with your body language, creating a calm and inviting place with your tone, and then really establishing a place where everyone feels like they have something that they can share and say is foundational to creating a great culture. Sorry, that's my computer going off. Let me turn it on mute. So Really interesting story. Of course, I just boiled down, what's like an 11 or 12 page story into like 30 seconds here. So, of course, the purpose of this review isn't to necessarily spoil the book, but to try and entice you in it. And another really interesting story was the second chapter. It's called The $1 Billion Day When Nothing Happened. And he discusses the how Google, of course, you might not know this, but Google used to be an upstart young company trying to establish a foothold in the internet land. And before Google AdWords had come about, people were starting to understand that ads were the foundational way to make the internet successful. And Google was working on Google AdWords, and they had a whole group of people who were supposed to make Google AdWords come to life. Well, there was this one guy who saw a note on a board. I think the note said, "These ads suck." And he wasn't part of the Google AdWords group, but he decided to go ahead and work on the problem of Google AdWords. And he actually worked on it all night, and he went home and worked on it. He came in early the next day and he worked on it. And he actually created what is known today as Google AdWords. It was $1 billion day for Google. Google AdWords is foundational for Google's wealth and success. Where's that guy now? He still works in his position at Google. Nothing really interesting happened. In fact, they interviewed him for this story, and he said, "Oh," they were like, "Remember that day, like when you changed Google?" And he was just kind of like, "What?" And he was confused. And then they're like, "The day we came with Google AdWords," and he was like, "Oh yeah, that day." And the lesson that we learn is, in places where great culture exists, it's not about an individual kind of puffing themselves up and making themselves bigger and more important. It's about the collective success of the group. And if you establish a place where people feel safe, then they can do that well. Because if you feel safe, you're not so focused on puffing yourself up and putting others down so that you can remain part of it. It's we're all here. We all feel safe. And that saying, you feel comfortable, you create an environment that feels comfortable and engaging, and where you're curious about what everyone has to say. That's how you create good culture as a leader. That's how you create good culture in a church. Are we curious about what our church members have to say? That's how you create good culture in a business. Are we curious about what our business and what our team members are telling us? Chapter 3 is an awesome story. I'll kind of skip over that. It's just about how Axis and Allies, there was this day where there was this Christmas truce, and basically everyone laid down their arms for a day to celebrate Christmas, and it was completely insane that it actually happened and remarkable. And in order for it to happen, you had to build a sense of safety. So once again, we're leaning into this whole idea. These first 3 or 4 chapters are all leaning into this idea of how do you garner and generate a sense of safety. But of course, read the book to get the full scope of things. Then in chapter 4, we kind of transition a little bit to how to build belonging. So something that the book talks about is there's these cues that we have, like these belonging cues that tell us like you're safe here. And there's things that you can do that create a sense of belonging. For example, to build a relationship. In order to build relationships, you create a sense of belonging. Or there's this guy who created, it's called, chapter 5, it's called The Architect of the Greenhouse. And there's this guy who basically built this greenhouse community, and he would inspire people to get together and gather around his common idea of what a good community should look like. And he did it all through simply talking and engaging, right? He did nothing. He brought people together. And this quote I circled here, it says, "He keeps things really simple and positive when it comes to people." I remember one time I was with him, and for some reason I got in my head that we should have a blimp. And Joe, the marketing manager, said not some little blimp, but a large blimp, like the Goodyear blimp. It was a completely crazy idea, and in retrospect, but Tony didn't bat an eye. I mean, he didn't even hesitate for a second. He said, "Good idea," and we talked about it. He keeps things really simple and positive when it comes to people. So often in life, like we tend to be challenging of other people's ideas negative around other people's ideas. But if you want to create good culture, keep things simple and positive. If someone comes up with an idea that's absolutely crazy and insane, just say, yeah, let's do it. Be encouraging and uplifting and positive, and that creates a sense of safety where people can be their authentic selves. It also talks about I think we're in chapter 5 here. Let me double check because I lost my place. So in chapter 5, another thing that I circled is this quote right here. It says, when an idea becomes part of a language, it becomes part of the default way of thinking. And they go on to discuss how there's this group of in this rugby team, and they have all these different types of sayings and all these little things that they would use to communicate to each other. Culture cues is what I would call them. And what these culture cues is when an idea becomes part of the language, it becomes part of the default way of thinking. And a lot of people in kind of our modern cultures mock, this idea of unified language around a common goal. But unified language around a common goal is actually powerful if followed up with legitimate action. And that is a key caveat, not a caveat. It's a key caveat. So think about it this way. When an idea becomes part of the language, it becomes part of the default way of thinking. So let's say you're part of a church and you're struggling. I'm just going to invent something here. I have no idea. But let's say you're struggling with accepting other people's ideas. So you could come up with a key quote or phrase that demonstrates we will be accepting of other people's ideas. And then you continually use this key quote and phrase in your sermons, and you create posters about it, and you create language around it, and you create teachings around it, and then you get your leadership bought into it, and then eventually this begins to seep in and it becomes part of the culture, and it's really important. So as you're looking to create good culture, think about what are some key words and phrases that tie into the type of culture I want to create, and specifically about building safety. And chapter 6 is called Ideas for Action. So basically, in order to build safety, how do you do that? And it kind of dives into what that looks like to create safety. And once again, it tells many stories. Here's another quote that I thought was great. Creating safety is about dialing into the small, subtle moments and delivering targeted signals at key points. The goal of this chapter is to provide a few tips to do that. And then it goes over many, many tips to communicate, share. So if you want to create a sense of safety, you have to dial into the small moments and then create targeted signals. What does that look like? Over-communicate your listening. 1. 2. Spotlight your vulnerability early on, especially if you're a leader. And this is huge. So spotlight your vulnerability early on, especially if you're a leader. This is fundamental to building safety for your team. Your team isn't going to feel safe if you're a leader who just kind of comes out and it has it all put together and does everything right and kind of has it all well, has it all well thought out and well planned. A leader should be vulnerable, and they should spotlight their own fallibility early on so that they can create a sense of safety and trust within their team, so their team feels like, well, if my leader fails, so can I. And this little quote they have here is, in any interaction, we have the natural tendency to try and hide our weaknesses and appear competent. If you want to create safety, this is the wrong move. Instead, you should open up and show you make mistakes. Invite input for simple phrases like, this is just my 2 cents, or of course, I could be wrong, or what am I missing, and what do you think? That's awesome. It's awesome. So we must, in order to build safety on the surface, we must invite people to come in. We must share our own vulnerabilities, especially if you're a leader. And one of the key points here is we need to eliminate the bad apples. And that's huge with building good culture. There does come a point when you do have to eliminate the bad apples. So next we go on to the Well, let me see. Is there any other? There's lots of other tips and tricks, I suppose, that they give you to build a sense of safety in your organization. But once again, dive into this book and read if you like. So those first 6 chapters are all about building safety. They discuss that in detail, and it gives you tools and resources to do it. Share some really fascinating, interesting stories. The next one is share vulnerability. And I think that's phrased very specifically. So think about what it means to be vulnerable versus to share vulnerability. So if you share vulnerability, it means it's 2 people engaging back and forth and sharing in their vulnerability. So you can't just expect other people to be vulnerable, nor can you be the only one who's being vulnerable. In order to create great culture, everyone must share in their vulnerability. I think that's beautiful, and I think that's key to creating great culture. And so in chapter 7, it talks about tell me what you want and I'll help you. So how do you create this sense of vulnerability? And I circled this little section in this chapter here. It says, so here's how we'll know if you had a good day. Randall continued, if you ask for help 10 times, then we'll know it was good. And if you tried to do it all alone, his voice trailed off. It'll be a catastrophe. So this is a story about how there's this waitress who got hired by this guy who has multiple restaurants in DC, and she was having her first day. And he told her, here's how we'll know your day is successful. If you ask for help 10 times. But if you try and do it all alone, it's going to be a catastrophe. That's how you build a sense of vulnerability. You invite people to be vulnerable through your words and through your actions. He actually painted a picture. He said, if you're vulnerable, you're successful. And if you're not vulnerable, then it's going to be a catastrophe. What a great story. Of course, the Navy SEALs actually engage in vulnerability all the time. So they tell another story about how in Navy SEAL groups, they'll execute on a fake mission, and then they'll all gather together after that mission, and they'll all share. What did we do wrong? What could we have done better? And everyone will share in vulnerability of how it all could have been executed in a more successful manner. And that is huge. Does your group that you're part of, the church you're part of, the organization you're part of, the group you're part of, does it invite you to discuss your failures and your shortcomings? And do they invite you to openly discuss them in a safe space where you won't be judged or condemned, but where you'll only be encouraged to be better? That's huge. I love it so much. So kind of turning through some of the pages here, checking to see if there's any other highlights in chapter 8. I don't think so. I highlighted a bunch of different pages with different stories and whatnot. And so in sharing vulnerability, another one I wanted to share was this comedic group. And they call it the Power of the Herald. And essentially what they do is 4 or 5 of the comedians all gather together, and they share in their vulnerability, and they what they do, excuse me, let me rephrase. I kind of got started on a rough start there. So 4 or 5 comedians get together, and they'll perform in an open mic scenario with no pre-planned jokes, and the only thing they can do is feed off what the other person's saying and doing to create an open and engaging and funny experience for the audience. And then all the other comedians who are in the audience will then judge their performance and give them open critiques for how they could have gone better. And the majority of the time, everyone gets terrible, horrible critiques about kind of how bad their performance was. But because it's a place where you can share in vulnerability, and you get the chance to be vulnerable and then the chance to critique the other comedians' steps as well, it creates a very healthy culture where some of the best comedians of our generations have come out of that group called the Herald. Of course, there's like 4 or 5 pages actually discussing that. Really beautifully written, and I encourage you to dive in and kind of see that in detail. So sharing in vulnerability is so important. So let's see. I think we're going to be. Let me check out and read a couple of the other things I've highlighted here. So one of the things I highlighted is the most important moments in a conversation happen when a person is actively and intently listening. The most important moments in a conversation happen when a person is actively and intently listening. In order to share vulnerability, it requires one person to actively share, but then one person to actively listen. And in order for a conversation to be important and beneficial, it requires someone who's genuinely and actively listening. Most of the time, we as people really struggle to listen. Either we listen to respond or we listen to entertain, but good listening is actually a skill. And in order to create great culture, we must become great listeners of each other and of the people around us. And when we do that, we create a sense where people feel that they can be vulnerable and they'll be listened to. And that is a beautiful thing that creates a culture and a group that people want to be part of. It's awesome. So let's go ahead and get to the kind of the final section of the book where it discusses well, let me see. I'm trying to find it here. Well, many apologies for the delay. So how to establish purpose? How to establish purpose in a group. So how do you create purpose in a group where so first we've talked about building safety. Then we talked about sharing and vulnerability, and we talked about tools for making each of those work. And then the last tool it goes over is, all right, let's go ahead and establish some purpose in these groups. So let me scroll to a couple of things that I've highlighted here. Give me just a moment. I'm just going to read you verbatim one of the sections out of this book. It says, "We are all paid to solve problems. Make sure to pick fun people to solve problems with. There's glory in making a mistake, stone after stone, to form the bridge." What does that mean? I believe that it means if you're going to create a sense of purpose, you need to create, well, I'm just going to cut this whole section out, I think, because it's pretty bad. I'm going to write it in my notes, 30 minutes in. We're going to kind of restart here. All right, so now we dive into the last section, which is about establishing purpose. And I want to read you a section out of the book, an entire section. It says, many leaders of high proficiency groups focus on creating priorities, naming keystone behaviors, and flooding the environment with things that link to the two. For example, if you spend time around New Zealand All Blacks rugby team, you will hear them talk about leaving the jersey in a better place. Or if you're not growing anywhere, you're not growing anywhere. Or keeping it blue head instead of red head, which refers to what happens under pressure. The pressure is a privilege, is one of their quotes. KBA, keep the ball alive. Front up or fuck off. It's an honor, not a job. Or go for the gap. And better people make better All Blacks. So it's an All Blacks rugby team, and they have all of these key phrases that actually establish a purpose and a unification around the group as a whole and what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And as you're trying to establish purpose in your cultures and in the groups that you're a part of, actually using key phrases and cultivating a culture of these are the things that we talk about, these are the things that we unify around are so important. Another quote right out of this book is, I asked Catmull how he knows when a team is succeeding. Mostly you can feel it in the room, he says. When a team isn't working, you see defensive body language, or you see people close down, or there's just silence. The ideas stop coming, or they can't see the problems. We used to use Steve Jobs as kind of a 2x4 to whack people in the head so they could see problems in the movie. Steve was good at that. So, in order to establish a sense of purpose and a sense of vulnerability and a sense of safety, all of these things have to align. You're not going to be able to establish purpose if people don't feel like they can be safe or they can be vulnerable. So it's important that each of these elements of the book are actually taken in order. So first you have to build a sense of safety. And then when people feel safe, they're going to share in vulnerability. And then when they share in vulnerability, they can unify around a common goal and common language in order to establish a common purpose. And that's how all the points of this book kind of tie together. Of course, the purpose of this isn't to read you the book, more to just kind of get your taste buds wet around what exactly is in this book and how maybe it could benefit you. Once again, I want to emphasize The Culture Code, The Secrets to Highly Successful Groups is a book that I would recommend for absolutely everyone, because you can't expect the leaders around you to be the only people that take the culture of your group, whether it be your church, whether it be your organization, or whether it just be a local group, seriously. You can't expect only the leaders to establish great culture. It actually has to be a unified effort from the entirety of the group around creating great culture. And your group will only grow and will only benefit the more you know. The reason why books like this are so important too is they're tools in your tool belt. A lot of people just be like, well, if you want to create great culture, you just need to freaking care about people. And you're right. And it can be boiled down that simply. However, reading books like this that strategically dive into what it means to create great culture gives you expanded perspective around what good and bad culture looks like. And then it allows you to strategically start changing your behaviors around that. Because you might have great natural behaviors that tie into building safety or sharing in vulnerability or establishing purpose that you didn't know about. So you might be the establishing purpose guy, or you might be the share and vulnerability girl, or you might be the build safety guy. And I don't know why I used those individual pronouns for each one. So sorry. But there might be an individual gift that you have within one of these groups, and then one of these key points in order to build a successful culture. And then reading this book and seeing how they're executed, you can then kind of garner that natural gift that you have and then apply it. But once again, great culture is only successful when the group as a whole unifies and gathers around the idea of, hey, we're going to make this a great place to work, or a great place to be, or a great place to play. So it can't just be one person. It can't be a lone prophet crying in the wilderness. So grab this book, read it, and then start sharing it with other people. I think it's excellent. That is the end of my first book review for 2023. I'm actually going to try and read one book every month. I'm putting it out here on the internet right now. My goal is to read one book every month, review it here on the podcast, and then create flashcards from 2 or 3 points that I want to kind of stick with me for the rest of the year from that book. So then the goal will be at the end of the year, I'll actually have 3 flashcards from each book. So that'll roughly be, whatever 3 times 12 is. That's 36. Tough math. So I'll have 36 flashcards with key points that I want to remember about this book and that I want to change and impact my life. And hopefully 36 points out of 12 books for an entire year, that should be pivotal. So I call it studying as opposed to actually just reading the book. Really important stuff, I think. But anyhow, that's a tangent. So thank you so much for tuning into the Entrenched podcast. I suppose I don't have anything more to say, but we'll see you again in a few weeks around the next book review. I'm doing a podcast on fatherhood, and we're also doing a podcast on the Entrenched book, Overcoming the Struggles in Life, or the Glory in the suffering of life. So all those are coming shortly, and they're in the works to be recorded here in the next month or so. Lots of great content coming. Lots of great video content coming. I appreciate y'all tuning in. We'll see you next time.